Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. I'd like to introduce the program today with just a series of facts about American prestige over the past few years. Internally, we've seen a list of controversies and scandals that has divided the population and weakened the administration. The government spying on American citizens, the government killing American citizens with drones, the government arming local law enforcement, the government monitoring journalists, the government spending more money than anyone in the history of the world. These controversies have been debilitating to America's leadership, but what's more important is what America's leadership has done on the world stage. The administration argues that it has contributed to global tranquility. It argues that Americans should be proud of the progress it has made. But look at some of the facts. The new administration started out in 2009 with what some critics called an apology tour. Since then, it launched a Muslim outreach, and it literally gave Russia a reset button after Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. A few years later, the president leaned over to the Russian president and whispered that he would have more flexibility in making compromises with Russia after his re-election campaign was over. And today, we've got Russia invading and annexing Crimea, and we've got pro-Russian rebels and possibly Russian soldiers themselves trying to destroy part of Ukraine and shooting down a jumbo jet in the process. The administration also saw terrorists attack and kill 4 Americans in Benghazi, including one of its own ambassadors. 2 years on, the perpetrators still haven't been brought to justice. In addition to the spy scandal against Americans, the federal government also has a scandal on its hands for allegedly spying on other countries, including Germany, including the German chancellor herself. Meanwhile, the administration has reduced pressure against Iran. It has actually started negotiating with Iran. That's a country that is undeniably the largest sponsor of terrorism in the world, and a country that is literally mortal enemies with the United States. America's relationship with Israel has also been severely damaged. That's just an objective fact. No matter who you blame it on, you have to admit that the relationship is at an all-time low. And it comes at a time when Palestinians are raining down rockets on Israeli citizens. The Obama administration has wound down its military effort in Afghanistan, even as the Taliban are returning to power. And it famously pushed hard to withdraw American troops from Iraq. And now an entire so-called state of terrorists has taken over northern Iraq. It was in this context that the president spoke to reporters yesterday, and as he was talking about confronting the ISIS terrorists in Iraq, he kind of summed up American foreign policy. He said, "We don't have a strategy yet." In a way, President Obama's comment punctuates a long decline of American prestige. It sends the signal that the rest of the world needs to figure out a new calculus, one that leaves America out of the equation.
This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world.
And he said unto me, you must prophesy again.
To begin with, I'd like for you to think about the world in 1945. That's not that long ago. Nazi Germany was shattered. Japan was shattered. In the Soviet Union, they had just lost 24 million people. Britain was in debt and struggling to simply survive. All the great nations were decimated for the most part, but a new one had emerged, the United States of America. In the mid-20th century, America became the greatest powerhouse on the face of the globe in economic terms, in cultural terms, in political terms, in agricultural terms, certainly in military terms. The only power to rival it was the Soviet Union. So when the free world needed intervention in Berlin or Korea or Vietnam, it was America that got involved to try to stabilize things and to slow down the Soviets. Think back, if you can, just a few decades ago, the United States was at the center of the most serious global issues: weather disasters, humanitarian aid, full-on military engagement. If a famine broke out, U.S. ships loaded up on American bumper crops and set sail. If economies needed funding or trade, it was America that stepped in. If a tiny free country was being intimidated by a communist power, American diplomats brought political pressure to bear. If war broke out, the belligerents always had to keep an eye on the American carriers. Nations on every continent took almost no action without at least calculating for how the Americans would respond. Now, there's been a lot of injustice and suffering and death over the past 70 years, that's for sure, just like there's always been that sort of thing. But if you look at it in objective terms, these few decades have been unusually peaceful compared to most of human history. Now, I want to return back to the events of today, as I talked about there at the top of the program, specifically referring you to a comment that was recently made by the German Chancellor. She said that the U.S. can't solve all the problems of this world anymore, and apparently she said that shortly after she was speaking with Vladimir Putin. It's quite a statement, and it doesn't mean that she necessarily said it in a derogatory kind of way. She's just stating fact as she sees the world today. That's a statement coming, a revealing statement at that, coming from a close American ally. This isn't coming from the leader in Syria, for example. From a nation like that, maybe you could expect a comment saying that, well, America is not going to be able to solve the problems. You do hear a lot of more negative comments to that end from some of America's enemies, but this is coming from an American ally. For Germany to make a remark like that, it shows just how fast the world is changing. We're living in a new and different world, one where American power is not what it once was, where America's influence is on the wane. Look at how many people see it. I mean, Russia certainly sees it. Vladimir Putin certainly sees it. Russia's taken over Crimea just this year. And then there were reports yesterday of them sending troops into Ukraine, into eastern Ukraine. You talk about an act of belligerence. But look, the United States has said outright, President Obama has said outright that America won't use force to defend Ukraine. And so the door, as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned, is wide open. Who else is going to step in and intervene at this stage in the history of the world? Well, there's other emerging powers coming out of Europe, as we've talked about before. But as of right now, I mean, who's going to intervene if America says out front, well, we're not going to involve ourselves in this? I mean, we've only basically applied some small sanctions, really, and tough-sounding rhetoric, but no real action. And this, of course, is after the United States, going back before the current administration. This comes at a time when the United States promised back in 1994 to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity if they would just give up their nuclear weapons. And so they give up their nuclear weapons, and here we are 20 years later, and their territorial integrity is being threatened from every direction. I mean, you could say that they have less territorial integrity than just about any nation in the world, except maybe a few in Africa, Iraq, of course. Ukraine's border is just deteriorating as these Russian rebels are now making advances with the support, these pro-Russian rebels, with the full support of Vladimir Putin's army. America used to intervene and solve problems like this. Not perfectly, but it used to take a lead role. It used to at least confront problems like this. But today it doesn't have the power or the will to do so. Where have you heard about this before, this development? It's prophesied in the book of Leviticus and elsewhere. It's talked about at length in the United States and Britain in prophecy, which we'll tell you about at the end of this program. We've talked about it at length at thetrumpet.com. You've heard about this for years. You've heard about it for decades if you know anything about the work that produced the United States and Britain in prophecy. Herbert W. Armstrong and his organization, the Worldwide Church of God. Look at other nations as they see Russia getting away with it, with what it's getting away with. China, of course, sees it. China sees that Russia's being incredibly aggressive and there are no consequences whatsoever. And so China is setting its sights on little democratic Taiwan, squaring off against Japan. What does the future hold for Taiwan, do you suppose? Well, basically, it's going to become a Chinese satellite as well, just like Crimea is for Russia. At some point, and you can expect the United States to stand down, to turn a blind eye to it. We just recently, this week, talked to you about the airstrikes in Tripoli, led by Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, and how that the U.S. had no idea that it was even happening. What a sign. What a sign of the times. I mean, here a second and third-rate power, regional powers, like Egypt and the UAE, they're just totally dismissive of U.S. interests in the region, unconcerned about America's reaction, just forging ahead, intruding another nation's airspace, launching an airstrike, one that didn't work that well, incidentally, but still, what a sign of the times, and using some of the equipment and training from the United States. We see that happening in Iraq as well. After the Iraqi forces laid down their weapons and ran, those weapons that America had supplied them with, ISIS was quite happy to pick them up, and now they're using them while on their deadly rampage. What a sign of the times. What a sign of weakness for the United States. I mean, really, the only nation that doesn't see America's stunning weakness today is the leadership of the United States of America. This was a comment that the President made just recently. The United States is and will remain the one indispensable nation in the world. This is repeated at all the campaign stops, all the fundraising stops, all the general speeches about the state of the world today. And we've talked to you about this before on the Trumpet Daily, how they say things are they've never been better, we're the indispensable nation and so on. But look, take an honest look at the world today, at world events. Do you really believe that? Other nations certainly don't. You look at the world as it is today, and if you have any awareness of history and Bible prophecy, you know that one of the direct reasons for the chaos that we're seeing spread over the world is this American withdrawal, the power vacuum left by the demise of the United States. Russia and China, and you can add Europe to the mix, they abhor a vacuum, as the saying goes. They're rushing to fill it. As the United States withdraws and retreats, let me just refer you to a quote by Peter Roth at the U.S. News and World Report. This is from earlier this year, March 3rd. He said, there may be a lot of people out there who are uncomfortable with the idea of the United States as the world's policeman, friends and foes alike. It's absolutely true that many of them are here in the United States, fed up with paying the bills to protect the world, and after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, unwilling to see how what happens halfway around the world is in America's security interests. There are people from the left and the right side of the political spectrum that just want to see America withdraw and isolate. That is America's attitude, to be introverted and isolated. Most Americans don't care about events that are happening halfway around the world. They don't care about it. They don't understand the significance of Russia taking over Crimea, or the Ukraine crisis, or the Kurdish group in northern Iraq that's resisting against ISIS, or any hotspot. And of course, they're right in knowing that there's a lot of problems right here in America that need to be dealt with. But still, just stepping back and looking at the impact that it's having on this world, and the way that it was coming out of World War II, and how that America's greatness in many ways helped the world. There are people, of course, that disagree with that and that are applauding, actually, America's decline, even some right here in America. But you take an objective look at the world today and the chaos that's spreading. Of course, America had its problems. Of course, its efforts were not always perfect decades ago. But we've got to see it in the context of world history. And furthermore, we've got to see that, well, if we're leaving a power vacuum there, what's going to rush in to fill it? Because a power vacuum was left in Iraq once U.S. withdrew. And look at what filled it. Mr. Armstrong's church, the Worldwide Church, and the college he raised up, Ambassador College, wrote this book. I forget the exact date, but it's an older booklet from the 1960s, maybe the 70s at the latest. And it's titled The Modern Romans, under the subhead, Militarism and a Calculated Risk. Notice this. Again, this is from, 40 or 50 years ago. Mr. Armstrong's group wrote, Rome found herself, this is talking about the history of Rome and tying it into what we're seeing in America today. Rome found herself, like the U.S. after World War II, in the unenviable position of being a world policeman. Her people grew weary of this burden and committed careless mistakes in a dangerous world. In a military age, surrounded by nations becoming more aggressive, hostile, and treacherous, Rome followed a policy that made her increasingly weaker defensively and more vulnerable to conquest. She thought her policies of defense would make her stronger, and for a while they did, but in the end, it says, they destroyed her. That's an eye-opening quote right there. Rome started to focus on itself. It turned inward. It turned to domestic issues. And as I say, no one can argue with the fact that there's a lot of domestic issues, problems, right now in the United States. But turning inward, well, look at what the result was for the Roman Empire. Look at what happened with the British Empire. Remember when Churchill was decrying the thinking of those that were little Englanders, as he said, that wanted to abandon the empire, the thinking of the empire, and instead turn inward. Well, look at England today, little England today, hoping it doesn't lose Scotland, raising the threat level, a terrorist threat level, because of all the British citizens that were fighting with ISIS and that are now returning home, some of them. That's the state of little England today. Continuing from this booklet, our allies are growing uneasy and alarmed about America's show of weakness and over-involvement with her internal problems to the point where they suspect America may not keep up its professed commitments. This is written 40 or 50 years ago, talking about the way America's allies would soon react to America's policeman efforts. As I said, it's a pretty eye-opening quote. Just want to read you a couple of verses from the book of Lamentations, Lamentations chapter 1 and verse 1. I mean, we're seeing this happen, what was talked about in that book, the modern Romans. We're seeing it happen to the United States. And people truly are deluding themselves if they think that the great American power that was in place for more than a half century will just keep on humming along despite these record levels of debt and all this chaos that's spreading and America taking a hit everywhere that you turn. It's all prophesied. God said it would be this way. Lamentations 1. And in verse 1 it says, "How does the city sit solitary that was full of people? How is she become as a widow? She that was great among the nations and a princess among the provinces. How is she become tributary?" I mean, how did this happen? She was so great. She was so powerful. And now she's like a lonely widow. Her great cities are becoming desolate, crime-ridden, filled with violence, poverty. How did it happen? Well, this book explains, the United States and Britain in Prophecy, as I say, it explains. Let me just read to you verse 2 before we get to the literature. It says, "She weeps sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They are become her enemies." See, lovers is just the biblical term for our supposed allies. This is about America and the people of Israel, the latter-day descendants of Israel, these once great nations of the earth now being put down, being besieged by curses. Great no more. That's what this is about. And you see it, well, we've seen it already play out with Britain, Great Britain, the once Great Britain, and now the single greatest superpower in the history of the world. It's happening right before our eyes. What a massive turning point we're at. What a punctuation that comment from the president the other day really did put on this demise that we're witnessing. We went from occupying that country and controlling it, basically, Iraq, I mean, to having no real strategy once it blows up in everyone's faces. What is it that you can do? I mean, this booklet we have on Lamentations talks about us being past the point of no return as a nation, but individually there's still time to wake up and to respond. You can certainly study history. We've talked about some of it just in this particular program. And you can watch the news as Jesus admonished us to do. Watch and pray always, as he said. But more than any of that, you can read this little book. It's a fairly big book, actually, The United States and Britain in Prophecy. It goes into this subject with a kind of in-depth analysis based on the sure Word of God that helps you prove, and even as it relates to your headlines, the headlines you're seeing today, it will help you see why the United States and Britain rose to power and prominence over the past couple centuries. And furthermore, it explains why we've seen such a stunning demise, why we've seen so many of those blessings withdrawn. It's a real page-turner, this book. It's an exciting study, a fascinating study, an eye-opening study. You'll learn why America and Britain before it has lost its greatness. And you'll understand more clearly, of course, about what lies ahead. There is hope, of course, but it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. When you think about what Jesus said in Matthew 24, great tribulation unlike anything this world has seen, but of course it does culminate in the return of Jesus Christ. That's the hopeful, positive news that we've got to see beyond the coming bad news. So make sure that you go to thetrumpet.com. You can download your copy of this book today, The United States in Britain in Prophecy, or you're welcome to call the 800 number on your screen, and one of our operators will send this out to you right away at no cost or obligation to you. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on the Trumpet Daily.